Welcome to the High Strangeness Factor with your host Steve Ward, although you can probably guess I'm not Steve Ward. I'm actually Andy Mercer, his other co-host who occasionally pops up, and also the show's producer. Tonight is a special extra little show I'm adding on. This is a show I recorded on my own about 3 years ago now, on an incident that I have been absolutely fascinated by for years. I'd heard of it, but a couple of years back I did some real digging into it and found the whole story was very interesting. This is my little solo show on the Dyatlov Pass Incident in the Ural Mountains in 1959. Have a listen and hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, we shall get into my original show on the Dyatlov Pass Incident, which happened in Russia, or the then Soviet Union, in 1959, where a group of 9 experienced hikers went off into the Ural Mountains on a 2-week expedition and turned dead. We have quite a lot of detail about the initial events of what happened, how they got there, through their own diaries, records that were kept. But something happened on the night of February the 1st into the 2nd that to this day has not been fully explained. But whatever occurred resulted in all of them dying. Some were recorded as dying of hypothermia, whilst others seem to have suffered more severe injuries. In actual fact, they all suffered some kind of injury, but some of them were actually would cause loss of life. As I say, what exactly happened remains a mystery, but it's become such a mystery that it's become known as the Russian equivalent of the JFK assassination in terms of people's interest, the number of theories that have been around. It's called the Dyatlov Pass Incident, named after Igor Dyatlov, who was the leader of the group. It was given that name because it was near a small pass between 2 large mountain peaks, which have Russian names but are translated into English as Dead Mountain and Don't Go There, which might seem quite strange names. They're actually translations of the local Mansi tribe's name for these 2 sites. Sometimes Dead Mountain has actually been translated as Mountain of the Dead, but actually, in fact, that's not quite accurate. It's Dead Mountain in the sense that nothing grows there, nothing lives there. It's no point going up there hunting because you won't find anything. And don't go there for the same kind of reason. Just don't bother going there. It's not particularly, it's very barren, it's not very pleasant. So it's not for a dark and sinister reason as they call that, but as I say, the correct translation is Dead Mountain, but obviously Mountain of the Dead sounds far better, far more sinister. So this is basically what tonight's show is all about. It's about the guys and girls who went on the expedition led by Igor Dyatlov, who never returned, or at least when they returned, they were no longer alive. First member of the group I'm going to mention was Simeon Alexander Zolotarev. He was, and we'll know him as Saskia from now onwards, or Zolotarev, the oldest member of the group by some margin. He was actually 37 years old, veteran of World War II, and had actually been promoted to the rank of sergeant in 1946 before leaving the army. Now, he was obviously not a student at the university. He was actually in the process of earning his tourism accreditation as part of his career. Now, an interesting thing was, some have speculated he may have had connections with the KGB, and may well have been on the tour group as an observer of what was going on under the auspices of the KGB. Now, as far as I understand, that's never been proven, and it's just been a vague kind of rumour. So he was, as I say, the oldest member of the group. In fact, he was almost old enough to be the parent of 1 or 2 of the group, at the age that he was. Interesting little sub-fact, he actually died on the eve of his 38th birthday, which would have been February the 2nd. Next up is Yuri Georgy Krivoshenko. He's 26 years old, born in 1935. He had previously graduated already and had worked for a while at the secret nuclear bunker in the town of Shvondoslovsk. I am going to struggle with these Russian names. I'm never very good at names. Anyone who's a regular listener to the old KTBF show would know that I struggle with names, but I will persevere nonetheless. The interesting thing was, there was a nuclear spillage in 1957, which he was involved in helping clean up. Now, the reason I mention that, which I'm going to come on to a bit later on, is that one of the victims of the whatever happened actually had high levels of radiation on him. And the chances are that this is the same radiation 2 years later are pretty remote, to say the least. In any case, that seems unlikely. Another interesting side fact, it was almost his birthday as well. His birthday was on February the 7th, so he didn't quite make it. He was known to be quite a lively individual, musically inclined, but had a bit of a volatile temper, which is something that we'll talk about a bit later on. Next we have Alexander Koletyov, or Kolya, as he was known by his friends. 25 years old at the time of the incident. He'd already been at work at the secret laboratory in Moscow, a most impressive feat for someone of his age and social status, apparently. He was only 22 years old at the time. Transferred to UPI to study technical physics, wanted to join the military, leading some to speculate that, again like Zolotarov, he had KGB links, but again there's no particular evidence for that. The girls apparently in the expedition considered him rather boring, which is not a very pleasant thing to say, but there we go. Next along we have Nikolai Therbio-Bretelli. Interestingly, Therbio-Bretelli is not exactly a Russian name. In fact, I could pronounce it terribly badly, but he was a father of a French communist who actually spent some of his time living in one of Stalin's terror camps. Not very pleasant. And in fact, his father died there, and he was actually born in the camp himself. So Nikolai had not the greatest of starts in life, but nevertheless he seems to have still remained quite a dedicated communist and was working with a degree in civil engineering at the time of the incident. Next we have Rustam Slobodin. I was about to say probably the easiest name to pronounce and then probably got it wrong. But anyway, he was a UPI graduate at just 23 years old, landed a job as an engineer. Known as Rustic to his friends, he, like Kravchenko, was musically inclined. He even brought his mandolin along for the expedition. It was one of the items that was found by the rescue team in the cache that were mentioned a little bit later on. Son of a university professor, and he's only just had his birthday on January the 11th, which by funny coincidence is my own brother's birthday, but there we go. Then we have Igor Dyatlov himself, the leader of the group, and the guy who planned the trip, shall we say. He was 23 years old and was his 5th year in his UPI radio engineering program. Scheduled to graduate in 1959. Very into radios, apparently. He built many shortwave radios. Interestingly, he was probably one of the younger members of the group, but was actually the organiser of the trip. So, there we go. And we have the first of the young ladies involved in the trip. This is Zinedina Kolmarova, known as Zina. I'll stick with Zina, much easier to say. She was 22 years old in the 4th year of her UPI studies of radio engineering, like Dyatlov, so perhaps that's how they knew each other, both studying it. In actual fact, she'd had a relationship with Doroshenko earlier on in the year, but it had already broken up by January 1959. So she was interesting. She could be out on a long trip with an ex-boyfriend. I can see that might have caused a few problems. And apparently she was once bitten by a viper whilst on a hiking trip and refused to let others carry her load. So she was obviously very much a dedicated individual. And her birthday is January the 12th, so they're all having their birthdays around about the same time as this particular trip. Then we have Yuri Doroshenko. This is the ex-boyfriend of the above. Doroshenko was a student at UPI. He had one time dated, as we just said, Zina. The relationship had been serious enough that he'd visited her parents. Oh dear, that is obviously a serious relationship. Told me it had already broken up before the trip. It's said to be an amicable breakup, so fair enough. His birthday was January the 12th. They all seem to have their birthday around about the same time as their trip. Then we have Ludmila Dobinina, known as Luda. Personally speaking, I find her probably the saddest member of the group. She's only 20 years old. You'll see photographs if you look her up, quite easy to find. She's got a very stern face, particularly even when she was young. She had this very stern look about her, until she smiled. And she seemed to have quite a friendly smile to her. And in fact, the website I'm looking at the moment has got a lot of photographs of her. She was 20 years old. She was a 3rd-year student studying engineering and economics. Apparently she enjoys singing and photography. Well, we know there's a lot of photographs that have been found and examined connected with this. So she was obviously the photographer of a lot of these shots. She'd actually been shot herself in 1957 during a hiking trip to the eastern Sayan Mountains when another tourist mishandled a rifle that injured her. So she became the group's medic apparently after Yudin turned back. Obviously must have been to qualifications himself. Her birthday was in May, so she was a little bit way up from the rest of the guys in terms of their birthday. And that's the 9 who passed away. The 10th person here, of course, is Yuri Yudin, the guy that survived. Only known member of the group to have survived. He suffered a lifelong illness and from a former injury and turned back, as we mentioned, when he was collecting samples for the University of Rocks. Unfortunately, he has no idea what happened to his friends, and I'd imagine he was probably haunted by the whole thing for most of his life. This question of what happened to my friends and what would have happened to me if I'd stayed with them. He apparently passed away in 2013, so he lived a ripe old age. So these then are the people who were involved, the 9 hikers who went into the Ural Mountains and didn't return alive. Fortunately for us, they kept diaries of their trek and photographs, which of course both survived because they're mainly in the tents. So we're able to find out exactly what happened in the days leading up to the event, or at least what they recorded as was happening to them, their trek in the mountains in the days leading up to the incident itself, whatever the incident of course was. So we're going to have a look now at those diaries, just to give us a real idea of their life, the days before it all happened. I'm going to start the diary at the date of January the 27th. As I say, this is the day that Yuri Yudin left the tour group, and it's mentioned here in the diary. But I'll just read this to you in its entirety. Weather is good. The wind is blowing in the back. Guys agreed that with the locals and a horse will, with driver, I should imagine, drive us to 2nd Cemetery settlement. The settlement is about 24 kilometres. We helped Grandfather Slava. Now, I assume this isn't a grandfather of anyone in the group, just it's obviously a term for an older man. Helped Grandfather Slava unload hay from carriage and waited for the horse. She went to get more hay and wood. We waited until 4 o'clock. Boys started rewriting some song. One guy sang beautifully. We heard a number of illegal prison songs, rather funny. Apparently it's counter-revolutionary crime, these prison songs, but there we go. Ognev told Igor how to find the house which we can spend the night. We bought 4 loaves of bread and went there at 4 o'clock. Soft warm bread, ate 2 pieces. Horses slow. With the pleasure to go without backpacks, we covered 8 kilometres in 2 hours. And there's a note saying along the Usma River. It gets darker, all the delays due to a horse. Yuri Yudin is riding with us. He suddenly fell ill. This is what we were talking about earlier, about the nerve damage problem. He can't continue with trek. He wants to gather a few local minerals, as we were saying previously, and return to 2nd Cemetery. I'll start that again. We collect the minerals for the university and return. 2nd Seminary is an abandoned village of geologists with a total of 2,025 houses. Now, just as an aside, this is me, not the diary. There's nothing strange or unusual in that. Obviously, they were used for a period of time, and then the area was obviously exhausted of minerals they were looking for, so they just abandoned the village. We're not talking about proper built houses here. We're talking about sort of shucks. We're talking about sheds and huts even, if I can get those words out properly. Only one of them, go back to the diary, is suitable for living. In complete darkness, we found a village and a house. We start a fire. Several people pierce their hands and old nails. Ouch. Everything is good. Then the horse came. Now, I'm not quite sure. That kind of follows on a bit strange. Everything is good, but then the horse came. It's just the horse made things bad, but this is what it says here. We were talking and throwing jokes until 3 o'clock in the morning. So, obviously, the group are doing well, getting on with each other, and not having any problems at all. Then we get on to January the 28th. We were awakened by Yuri Koshnevenko and Alexander Kolotov. Weather is perfect. It's only -8 degrees. Only -8, good lord. After breakfast, some of the guys, headed by Yuri Yudin, our well-known geologist, I think there's a bit of a joke in there, went to look for local minerals. They didn't find anything except pyrite and quartz veins in the rock. Spent some time with skills, fixed and adjusted the mounting. This is obviously the mounting, the equipment they're carrying, I assume. Yuri Yudin knows he goes back home. It's a pity, of course, that he leaves us, especially for me and Xena, but nothing can be done about that. Now, those diary entries, again, they are from Nick, I believe. Nikolai, from what I'm looking at here. Obviously, he must have got on well with Yuri from the sound of it, and with Xena. This is a same diary entry again for the 28th of January. Now this, from what I can see in his Rostam Slobodin, he might be doing this one. Anyway, we get up to the river Uzva, and we take turns to head the group for about 10 minutes. Depth of snow cover is significantly less than last year. Clearly been here before. We have to stop and scrape the wet, melting snow from our skis. Yurka Kuri, which is Yuri Kuroshenko, is behind and makes sketches of the route. We pass a few cliffs on the right bank of the Lova River. Overall, the terrain becomes flatter. We stop at 5:30 p.m. Today we spent our first night in the tent. Now the tent itself, from what I understand, was actually made by Igor Dyatlov himself. It was 2 tents he put together to form one very large tent. Obviously heavy, thick cotton. Now, one of the things we'll talk about a bit later on is how the guys exited the tent that night. It's a little bit strange, but one thing I want to say clear now is we're talking about tents in the late 1950s. It wasn't your modern zip up, zip down, get out in 30-second kind of tent. We're talking about tents that would have had buttons and ties that would take, a good 2 or 3 minutes to do up and undo. So that's significant. It also contained quite a large stove, which is quite clever, which you think in a tent, I don't know if they get that, not to set the tent on fire, but it's a little small compact stove with a chimney that goes out the back of the stove. And indeed, some of the photographs that you can see of the Dyatlov group, you can see the tent set up with the stove coming out the back of it, which is rather helpful, of course, enclosed in a tent, even in the cold winter terrain. It's going to get some warmth from that tent, so from the stove, I should say. So that's obviously a very good idea. The guys are busy with the stove, it continues, with some things complicated and others not. We sit for dinner. After dinner we sit around the campfire and sing beautiful songs. Xena even tries to learn how to play the mandolin. Now the mandolin belonged to Rustak, he'd brought it with him for the tour, was trying to train Xena how to play it. Then again and again we resume our discussions, mostly about love. Someone come up with the idea that we need to take a special notebook for ideas that we might come up with. Once we are done, we'll making our way inside the tent. Nobody wants to sleep by the stove, and we all agree that Yurka Kuri shall sleep there. Now, something I've come across in my research, Yurka is, of course, Yuri Kuroshenko, that he may have had a bit of a temper, may have been a bit of a grumpy git. May have had a few problems, but so he seems to be the one that gets the butt of things, ends up having to sleep by the stove. Personally speaking, I'd be happy by the stove. It'd be a bit warmer than everywhere else, but for whatever reason he didn't want to sleep there, but he was asked to. Now the tent itself is divided into 2 compartments, obviously one for the girls and one for the guys, which again is a quite clever little innovation. So assuming the girls must have been further up towards the entrance, because the stove was at the rear end of the tent. So again, that's me speculating, I don't know, but I would imagine that's how it worked. Yuri moved into the second compartment with terrible cursing and accusations that we betrayed him. We can't fall asleep for a while and arguing about something. Oh, okay. Next entry, January 29th, second day of our trip. We made our way from Lovzy River to River Ashby. We walked along a Mansi trail. Now, Mansis are important people we're going to get back to in a minute. The weather is -13 degrees. The wind is weak. We often find ice on the Lucy River. And that's it. Now, the Mansi tribe people. Now, the Mansis are indigenous to the region. I've been there probably as early as the 1200 AD. And indeed, the early stages of the investigation, apparently the Mansis themselves came under suspicion because they seemed possibly there might have somehow been, the tour group might have been walking on sacred ground and may have caused an issue there. But that idea was quickly dropped. It was clear that the Mansis themselves are peace-loving people. They don't tend to interfere with anybody. There is, I believe, reports that they ran into some Mansis at one point of the trip earlier on, and they're not mentioned so far in these diaries, that the Mansis advised them just not to go there, because it's not particularly pleasant there. Not that there's anything dark or sinister or scary, just the weather's never very good. Understandably, it's the end of January, of course, so the snow is going to be quite heavy and strong. But I mean, it wouldn't have made any sense for the Mansis to have been responsible for the deaths. First and foremost, the Mansis had rifles and guns, and the easiest way to dispatch somebody you don't like is to shoot them. Now, none of the tour group was shot. There's no evidence at all of any of them having suffered any gun-related injuries, so it would make no sense. The tent, when it was discovered, still contained most of their equipment, knives, compasses, eating equipment, food, all sorts of things that, had the Mansis been responsible, would most likely have taken for themselves. But yet all these things remained in place, so it seems highly unlikely that they were involved in the deaths, but certainly they helped in the search parties, and it may well have been the Mansi dogs, Mansi trained dogs, who found some of the bodies. That's me speculating, I don't know. I know they were found by snow dogs, and I do suspect they may have been Mansi dogs. Anyway, returning to the diary. January the 30th. Diary is written on the cold on the go. Not quite sure what that means, but obviously it's got very cold. Today is the third cold night on the shore of the Aspy River. The stove does a great job. Some, Theobald and Kroshenko, think we need to construct a steam heat in the tent. The curtains hung in the tent are quite justified. We get up at 8:30 a.m. After breakfast, we walk along the Aspy River, but again there's ice dams, so we do not allow us to move forward. Let's go to the shore of the Sledge Deer Trail. Now that's interesting. It's the Deer Trail, which I imagine is the Mansi Trail again. In the middle of the road, we discovered markings left by the Mansi, and he's written Mansi, 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 Mansi. This word repeated more often in our conversation. The conversation repeating itself. The Mansi are the people of the north, very interesting and unique people that inhabit the North Polar Urals, close to the Timurian region. They have a written language and leave characteristic signs on the forest trees. Now, there are photographs that exist of the tour group where they've found these markings on the trees. What I found quite interesting looking at those markings is they are a little similar to Ogham markings, Ogham runes as they're sometimes called, that we find in Ireland. So, I mean, I can't imagine for a moment that the Mansis and the Irish have any connection with each other at all, but there is some similarity in their writings, which is quite interesting. Anyway, moving back to the diary. 30th of January. Weather. The temperature in the morning is between -17 and -13, good lord, during the day, and -26 at night. Cold weather. The wind is strong, southwest, and snow begins to fall. Clouds are thick. Temperature characteristic of northern Urals. Mansi signs tell us about the animals they saw, resting stops and other things. It is particularly interesting to solve its meaning for the tourists as well as historians. Deer Trail is over, assuming it's come to the end of it. The forest gradually thins out and gets shorter. Lots of dwarf birches and pines. It is impossible to walk on the river. It is not frozen. We have to look for solid ground. Day wore on, and we started to look for a place. A bivouac. I've worked it out eventually. Where they're going to store some of their equipment for the journey back. We stopped for the night. Strong west winds. It knocked snow off the cedar and pine trees, creating the impression of falling snow. As always, we started a fire and put the tents up on the spruce branches. We were warmed by the fire and go to sleep. This is Igor Dyatlov's diary and this is January the 31st. This is the last day that Igor describes. January 31st. Today the weather is a bit worse than the wind. Snow because the sky is perfectly clear. That isn't very good English, although of course it's translated from Russian anyway, but I'm not quite sure. Weather is a bit worse than the wind. Snow because the sky is perfectly clear. Okay. Came out relatively early, around 10 AM. Took the same beaten Mansi trail. So far we walked along the Mansi trail, which we passed by Deer Hunter not long ago. We met his resting stop yesterday, apparently. Today was surprisingly good accommodation for the tent. Air is warm and dry, despite the low temperature of -18 to 24 degrees centigrade. Eesh. Walk is especially hard today. Visibility is very low. We walked for 1.52 kilometers per hour. I'm not quite sure how they work out what speed they're walking, but there we go. We are forced to find new methods of clearing the paths for skis. The first member leaves his bag on the ground and walks forward, and then returns, rests for 10 to 15 minutes with the group. Thus we have a non-stop paving of the trail. Oh, that's clever. It is especially hard for the second to move down the new trail with full gear on the back. We gradually leave the Aspo Valley, and the race is continuous, but quite smooth. We spend a night at the forest boundary. Wind is western, warm, penetrating. Snow-free spaces. We can't leave any of our provisions to ease the ascent to the mountain. About 4 PM we must choose the place for the tent. Wind, some snow. Snow covers is 1.22 meters thick. Tired and exhausted, we start to prepare the platform for the tent. Firewood is not enough. We don't dig a hole for a fire. Too tired for that. We had supper right in the tent. Hard to imagine such comfort elsewhere on the ridge, with a piercing wind, hundreds of kilometers away from human settlement. Now, to me it sounds like they were starting to struggle a little bit, whereas the earlier diary entries, despite being very cold, seemed to have been more of an easier time, but this seems to have slowed right down. Now, I would assume it was because of the snow, but they're saying the sky is perfectly clear, so there's no real snow problems, but they're obviously tired out by this point. Now, to my knowledge, that is the last diary entry that we have. This is the group's journal itself, as I say, others are written in it, and the last entry, which I just read, was the Igor Dyatlov himself. Okay, so we're having looked at the diaries now. I think we can work on a real timeline of events, partly based on, of course, the diaries, and also from other information that we've managed to sort of put together about when roughly things might have been happening. We'll start the timeline really from the last sort of active day at the end of January. So just reading from that point. January 31st. Group reaches the stage of the highlighted zone where they will break away from the river. They spend the day preparing for the climb. According to the march plan, obviously their route, they intended to leave a stock of supplies in a corn chandler's shop. However, another account suggests that they actually constructed a shelter in the nearby wood for the same reason. Bringing us into the events themselves, closer to the actual incident. On the morning of February the 1st, 1959, the group set off for what shall be their last campsite. The distance they will travel is not great and only about 2.5 miles. Now we know from reading the diaries earlier on that the weather actually had rather closed in on them, that we're talking about quite a lot of snowfall and high winds, and indeed it's saying the same here, that the weather itself had turned rather cruelly and was making the journey very slow going. February the 1st, 1959, around 4 PM. Towards the evening of the 2nd of February, they find themselves on the slopes of the Dead Mountain. They set up camp on the exposed slope of the mountain some 10 miles from the destination, Evidence from the photograph suggests that they were in a positive frame of mind, that they had cleared the trees and skiing should become easier from this point on to the mountain. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment, because one of the things that has been brought up by other researchers is that it's a pretty strange place to pitch a tent, 2/3 away up the side of a mountain. We're not too far away. There are trees and wooded forested area that would offer far more shelter from the more harsh conditions, and the journey was within a mile away. So it seems an odd place for them to choose. In fact, other researchers who've spoken to people experienced in camping in frozen terrain have also said the same, that this seems an odd place for them to choose to set their tent. But they did, as we know, so there we go. February the 1st, still, same day, around 6 to 7 p.m, the group eat a meal. February the 1st, between 7 p.m. and 10 p.m, tired, at least some of the group settled down for the night. This is apparently evidenced by the fact that at least some of them were not fully clothed when they abandoned the tent. Now, actual fact, we know that none of them were fully clothed when they abandoned the tent. They'd all in some degree of undress. The temperature was probably as low as -18, which we know is actually down to -25 by the middle of the night, which to the right of this is suggesting is a little odd to be undressing at all because of how cold it was. But then again, we are dealing with a very experienced group of hikers. They are in a tent that does have a stove, although apparently it was still in the stowed position when they exited the tent, i.e. it wasn't set up for use. But they were used to having some kind of warmth inside the tent from the stove. So the question as to why they were undressing was, well, perhaps they didn't want to be fully clothed and they slept through the night, and there was afforded enough warmth perhaps from each other's bodies being close by, or the fact that the stove was normally set up. Anyway, reading a bit further. Estimated somewhere between 9:30 and 11:30 p.m, which is apparently based on the state of undigested food found in the stomach of the deceased. The group, in various states of undress, cut or ripped through the sides of the tent. Now we know, again from other reports, that it was cut with a knife, and then one of the group was found to be carrying a knife, which is probably the knife that was used to cut their way out of the tent. They flee downhill to the nearest forest. Now, as we were saying before, flee is not necessarily the right word, because the impression is that they weren't particularly rapidly running any kind of great panic or need to escape, but they were actually probably taking a bit more time, but perhaps trying to keep together with being impeded by whatever was happening, be it a light, as I was saying before, or if it was through noise or something else. Reading on from this, they know they will not survive long in the outside temperature, so they must be fleeing for their very lives. Well, that's one thing I think we can establish, that whatever the threat was that they had to exit the tent from, it was, as far as they were concerned, a matter of life or death. Why they should cut through the tent, bizarre in itself. Not necessarily, from what we were talking about before, that the fastening of the tent was done by buttons and ties, which could well take a minute or two to be released, and if you're absolutely fearing for your life, you're not going to stand around for a couple of minutes undoing ties. If you've got a knife in your hand, you're going to cut your way out of the tent. That makes sense. Tracks in the snow suggest that the group were scattered at first, but came back together at some distance, around 300 metres down the slope. Now, I don't know exactly where that comes from, because again, other reports I've read suggest that the tracks themselves seem to start fairly soon after the tent in a more orderly fashion, but perhaps not. Perhaps they are mixed up with footprints of the people who found them, the rescuers, because obviously you had to get to the tent to discover the tent was in the state it was in. So there would be footprints from those that have found the tent. Again, speculating on my own part, I'm not entirely sure. February the 1st again, estimated between 10:30 and 12:30 p.m, or 12:30 a.m. as it should really be. It appears that the whole group hid under a larger than average pine tree at the edge of the nearby forest, approximately 1.8 to 1.55 miles from the tents. Absolutely, this is of course the cedar trees where two of the guys were found where the others almost were there together at one point, where obviously one part of the group headed further into the wood and ended up in the small ravine, while others decided to head back to the tent. Again, I think this idea that they were trying to find their storage area, I think it's adding weight to it, that they stopped there to discuss, okay, where the hell do we go now? Do we go back to the tent? Is it safe to go back up there? Or do we go and find the cache and supplies, with the belief that they were closer to it than they actually were? I'm starting to feel that is a real possibility, at least to explain this part of the experiences they were having. Estimated, again, somewhere between 10 and 11 p.m, desperately cold, but clearly in mortal fear of returning to the tent, they light a fire. This has been raised again as an interesting point, is exactly how they lit a fire. Did they have with them, although they didn't have time to put clothing on, did they have enough time to take with them means of starting a fire? I really don't know. That's an interesting question. The fire helps, but Dyatlov knows that it's not enough to keep them alive. The great pine tree is lower than the campsite, and its broken branches suggest that at least one of the team tried to climb the tree to see if they could see what was happening, or to retrieve branches. We don't entirely know. Again, going back to the notion that there was this strange enormous light that was occurring that was enough to scare him out the tent in the first place, then perhaps it is producing light of some kind. But this would suggest that it had been around for at least an hour or so. So, I don't know. Possibly, possibly not. Desperate and disorientated, 3 members of the team decide to try to return to the tent. Dyatlov, Zina, and Rostam are the ones that are found heading apparently back towards the tent. They, of course, all 3 are found having died of hypothermia. Though, of course, all 3, as with everybody in the group, seem to have sustained some kind of injury. The 3 are found separately. Dyatlov himself 300 metres away from the tent, Rostam found 480 metres, and Zina 630 metres from the pine tree. We'll now move into what would effectively be February the 2nd at around 12 to 1 a.m. When the leader of the team fails to re-emerge, Dyatlov himself, the remaining members of the group wait for some sign of hope. This is obviously getting into the realms of speculation, but this next line I think is probably again has weight to it, that Georgi and Yuri both die from cold while waiting for the others to return. It may be said that these 2 died before Dyatlov decides to try for the tent, as their deaths may have been the catalyst for this decision. Again, speculation, but understandable speculation, that the fact that the 2 of the guys were now had or on the verge of dying meant they really need to do something, or they're all going to join them in death. So perhaps that was the reason why some of them decided to set off back towards the tent, while others decided they were going to continue further into the wood. Members of the group were still alive and have taken clothes from the dead bodies of their comrades. This we know definitely. In particularly Luda, who wraps her feet with the trousers no longer needed by Kravchenko, because of course her feet were uncovered and needed to be covered up, so trying to use something. Again, a bit of speculation here. They're straining their eyes to look in the direction of the tents. The tents plural, there's only one tent. Finally, they make the decision to move further away along into the woods, and it is likely that this time that the injuries sustained by the group occur. Now, this, of course, is the question. What happened to the other 4? That 3 of them sustained injuries enough to kill, and while the 4th not necessarily died of the injuries, they were nevertheless badly injured. It does remain a bit of a mystery. The survivors take a further 75 to 700 metres, 750 to 700 metres into and along the woods before descending into a ravine. They huddle together, but it is clear that Nicholas is dead. They wait, and as they do, Dabina dies from chest injuries and hypothermia. Now, to say Luda died from chest injuries is an understatement, of course, as we've discussed previously. The injuries she sustained were substantial. Broken ribs, and, of course, the mysterious removal of the inside of her mouth, which, as I said before, judging by the fact there was blood found in her stomach, suggests she was still alive and heart beating when this occurred. So to just say she died from head chest injuries is an understatement, to say the least. Alexander Rostorov takes or is given her coat and hat to try to keep himself warm. Estimating around 12:45 to 1:45 a.m., Zolotarov dies from a combination of chest injuries and hypothermia. Again, these physical injuries that have never been explained. And again, estimating roughly between 1:30 and 2:45 a.m., Kolotaryov, frozen, afraid, alone and exhausted, drifts off to sleep, to never awaken. It's getting rather speculative, but kind of dramatic language. February the 12th, 1959, it is the date the Dyatlov ski team were meant to arrive at the town of Vichy, send a telegram announcing the completion of their route. They of course do not arrive, and obviously no telegram is sent. This is the first real indication that something has gone wrong. However, a later conversation with B.E. Slobodivem suggests that the team had planned an extension to the trip that would only arrive in Vichy on the 14th. Now, I know that this was information that Yuri Yudin had, that they had extended the trip time slightly and was supposed to inform the university of, which unfortunately he forgot. Well, understanding the guy was not well, this is why he left the trip, so maybe that's why he forgot. 20th of February. Relatives of the missing skiers pressure the management of the institute into dispatching a search and rescue party. 21st to 25th February, an initial failure to find the skiers results in the military and civilian authorities becoming involved in the search. Soldiers and officers take part in both planes and helicopters are dispatched to the area. The first sighting is made by a pilot of a plane, of the tent. 26th February, searchers find the abandoned camp in the eastern slope of mountain 1079, Kolatskaya. The tent is badly damaged. A chain of footsteps could be followed leading down towards the edge of the nearby woods on the opposite side of the pass, 1.5 kilometers northeast. But after 500 meters, they were covered with snow. The forest edge, under the large old pine tree, the searchers find the remains of a fire, along with the first two dead bodies, which of course we know about, shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. Kind of exaggeration, but they were not fully dressed, certainly. They were buried under snow. The branches of the cedar under which they were lying were broken at a height of about 5 meters. On the trunk of the tree, forensic doctors found traces of skin and other tissue. With this evidence, it is believed that they climbed the tree and broke off branches until their hands were literally raw. Again, possibly, or maybe trying to observe what was going on around them. February 26th, 1959. 300 meters from the fire and in the direction of the tent, searchers find the body of Dyatlov himself. He is lying on his back with his head towards the tent. One hand is holding a small birch tree branch, the other is shielding his head. May have just been how he fell. It's not entirely clear, of course. We can't necessarily say he was actually protecting himself from anything. February 26th. 180 meters from the body of Dyatlov, in the direction towards the tent, the searchers find the body of Rustin Solodin. He is lying face forward in the snow. Slobodin is also found to have skull fractures of about 17 centimeters in length. However, experts have determined that his death was most probably from hypothermia. February 26th again. A further 150 meters from the body of Rostom, and even closer to the tent, the searchers discover the body of Zina. Traces of blood are found nearby. We don't know the source of the blood. It is worthy to note that it was Zina, a woman, who made it furthest. Yeah, well, okay, lighter, moving swifter. Let me jump forward to the 4th of May, where a second group is found buried in the ravine under 4 meters of snow, or what would have been, of course, by this point. It was thawing, so it was rapidly disappearing. So there you have it. That's a kind of a timeline of the events. We are certainly looking at around about mid to late evening on February the 1st, where whatever happened, happened. Before we really get into the theories about what may have happened to the group, I'd like to just look for a little while in a little bit more detail at the injuries sustained by the remaining 4 who were found in the ravine on the May the 4th, because their injuries are quite extraordinary. Now, obviously, this is going to be a bit graphic, so again, I apologise in advance, but I think it's important to look at these to get a real idea of what on earth could have happened to them. Not that we can get much of an idea, really, because it doesn't make sense. I mean, we're talking about severe injuries that were described as being, as I said, like having been hit by something substantial, or perhaps dropped from a great height with no obvious external damage, but plenty of internal damage, and including some rather nasty organ removal, which obviously resonates with other strange, potentially paranormal events that have occurred mainly in America, but that's something we'll get into on another day, I think. But let's look at the 4 that were found in the ravine. Let's get on to the actual the damages. The first person we're going to talk about is little young Luda, a 21-year-old. She suffered physically the most damaging injuries of all, and I will read out those in a moment. But first, let's just look at the clothing she was wearing. She was wearing a short-sleeved shirt, which is interesting because she's seen in some photographs wearing a short-sleeved shirt, a long-sleeved shirt, 2 sweaters, long underwear, long socks, 2 pairs of pants, trousers. The external apparel was badly damaged by fire and subsequently ripped. Now, as far as I understand, there was no sign of a fire in the ravine, although I could be mistaken in that. I've not read of anything to do that, so I do wonder where that burning took place. 2 pairs of warm socks, a 3rd sock not paired, and half of a sweater wrapped around her foot. So obviously they've attempted to cover their feet and extremities to avoid the extreme temperatures of the snow. Bearing in mind, we're talking around about minus 25 degrees for the weather itself, and of course snow is obviously frozen water below 0. Anyway, let's get on to Luda's injuries, because they are particularly quite unpleasant, and I will apologise in advance for this, because some of this is a little bit stomach churning. Be brave, listener, be brave. Her injuries included, and this is one of the areas of debate as to how this happened, but she was missing her tongue, hypoglossal muscle, which I believe is the muscle that attaches the tongue to the inside of the mouth, and muscles of the floor of the mouth. So the whole lower part of her mouth was missing. Now, I'm not talking about teeth and jaw. They were still present, but the lower parts of her mouth were missing. Soft tissue around the eyes, eyebrows, and left temporal area missing. Her body was partially exposed. Eyes missing. Nose cartilage broken and flattened. Again, broken and flattened suggests being hit with something or hit in the face, rather than simply being from where she may have fallen. Now, ribs number 2, 3, 4, and 5 were broken on the right side, with 2 fracture lines visible. Ribs 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 were broken on the left side, with 2 fracture lines visible. Soft tissue of the upper lip missing, revealing teeth. Upper jaw, massive hemorrhaging to the heart's right aorta. A bruise in the middle of the left thigh, damaged tissues around the left temporal bone, and about 100 grams of coagulated blood in her stomach, suggesting, and this is the nasty bit, suggesting she was alive and her heart was still beating when her tongue and oral muscles were removed. Cause of death, hemorrhaging to the right aorta of the heart, multiple fractured ribs, and internal bleeding. Now, let's go back to this question about the missing tongue. Some people have suggested that microscopic organisms may well have consumed this material. Whilst that's not impossible, it seems unlikely because of the fact of the coagulated blood in her stomach, which, as I say, strongly suggests that she was alive, or at very least her heart was still beating when her tongue and oral muscles were removed, suggesting it was a sudden and violent removal rather than slowly, gradually eaten away. Now, if it were eaten by microorganisms, why did nobody else suffer a similar fate and damage? Okay, we are talking about sort of a few months after they actually passed away, actually died, but it seems odd. It seems unlikely to have been something along those lines, suggesting that something, or someone even, removed them deliberately. Body of Simeon Sasha Zolotarev, the 38-year-old, the oldest guy of the group. He was wearing two hats, a scarf, short-sleeved shirt, long-sleeved shirt, black sweater, a coat with two upper buttons missing, long underwear, two pairs of pants, a pair of skiing pants, a pair of socks, a pair of warm leather handmade shoes known as a burqa, apparently. So he sounded like he was the most dressed of all the victims. His injuries included missing eyes, missing soft tissue, left eyebrow and bone exposed, flailed chest, which I don't exactly know what that means, but apparently flailed chest. But ribs number 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 were broken on the right side with 2 fracture lines. An open wound in the right side of the skull with exposed bone. Cause of death, traumatic internal injury. Now, interesting thing here again is we are talking about injuries that defy explanation. They aren't the sort of thing that could be caused by another human being. This is autopsy report and was described as being caused by a force greater than a human can manage. They've been compared to injuries that might have been sustained in a car crash. Now, of course, obviously they weren't in a car crash, but that kind of blunt force trauma. Now, we've got injuries to the right side of Sasha's skull, suggesting perhaps again that he may have been struck by someone or something. The photographs that exist are quite unpleasant, I have to say. The skin withdrawn from the skull and empty eye sockets. Again, the eyes are one issue that we could perhaps talk about, because it's quite likely that in the intervening time the moisture in the eyes basically dissipated. Maybe eyes are soft tissue and they don't tend to last very long. His body was found very close to Alexander Kolotov. They almost as if perhaps had been placed together. Actually, according to this report, relatively little is stated about the state of his body. Again, though, from the photographs, you can see he does appear to be missing his eyes. Injuries that are mentioned include, say, tissue from around the missing eyebrows and eyes, skull partially exposed, broken nose with open wound behind his left ear and deformed neck. Given as cause of death as hypothermia, but given the skull fractures exposure, we can wonder if perhaps something else had happened there. Now, interestingly, the photograph that exists of his body with Sasha together in situ shows something around his neck. Now, I'm no expert, but that does look very much to me like a camera. Although apparently no such camera was found with him, so that's a bit of a mystery. If it was a camera, where did it go? If it wasn't a camera, what is it? But it's clearly something hanging around his neck. Then we move on to our French native original friend, Nikolai. Again, not a lot was reported about his body in terms of clothing. There is a listing of injuries, which include multiple fractures to the temporal bone of the skull, with extensions into the frontal and sphaenoidal bones. Now, I know that's parts of the skull, basically. A bruise in the upper lip on the left side, and hemorrhage into the lower forearm. Official cause of death, traumatic internal injury. So it doesn't go in an awful lot of detail, but again, there's a graphic underneath of the page I'm looking at that does show, again, a sizable area, about the size perhaps of an orange or a small grapefruit, where there is multiple fractures to the skull. Again, looking like he's been hit on the side of the head, basically, with some object, something to cause a blunt force trauma. So that's the 4 victims, or injured parties, shall we say. They were all found in the small ravine, which was approximately 75 metres from where the others were found. And, oh no, I'm telling a lie. 75 metres from the cedar found outside an improvised, 75 metres from the cedar tree, where the first 2 victims were discovered. That's all we can say about the bodies themselves. They were obviously taken back and autopsied. I know from another program I listened to regarding this case that Organs were removed and placed in storage jars for later inspection, but were not labelled. So unfortunately, there was quite a reasonable chance that body parts got mixed up. Now, obviously, these initial reports were taken at the time when the bodies were first examined, so I think we can take these as acceptable and as read, but unfortunately, later testing that is done, which includes looking for radiation and as the aforementioned discussion of injuries that are comparable to those of a car crash, we can't say exactly whose body was examined. I'm assuming we're talking about the bodies in the ravine because of the amount of damage they suffered. Although everybody seems to have had some kind of physical injuries, not just frostbite, but actual cuts and bruises, etc. It is the bodies of the 4 in the ravine that suffered the most damage. Although Alexander Kolotov is described as having died of hypothermia, there is clearly injuries described with partially exposed skull, which I assume is probably for the skin itself may have withdrawn through decay, but I'm not a medical man, so I'm speculating here, but the chances are perhaps there was a cut injury from which the skin retracted from both sides of the cut to expose the bone. So it sounds like they all met some kind of physical trauma of some kind. Obviously, at the moment, we can only speculate as to what that might have been. But that's the condition of the 9 bodies that were discovered. Say 4 were discovered on the 27th of February, 1 discovered on the 5th of March, and the final 4 discovered on the 4th of May, following the spring thaw. So there we go. Okay, so having looked at the events themselves, what happened to the guys, let's really move on to the theories, the attempts to explain what actually happened to the Dyatlov group. There are, of course, many, and some of them we can see as being reasonable, quite possible. Others, perhaps a little bit more outlandish, but I'm going to try and stick with looking at the more feasible or more possibly believable explanations. Really starting with the idea of them escaping the tent because of an avalanche. Now, I think we've talked a little bit about this earlier on, about the inclination of the hill and the fact that they found themselves camping 2/3 of the way up the mountain, which seems an odd choice, given the potential for things like earthquakes, or avalanches, I should say. But yet they were quite a long way up, and at the elevation they were, the height or the angle of climb towards the summit was actually pretty shallow. So it seems, to what I understand about the causes of avalanches, that it basically was too shallow. That the snow would not have gathered any kind of momentum to produce any serious danger from being buried in it. It's just too shallow. Indeed, if it were an avalanche that caused the group to panic, to cut their way out of the tent to escape, then there are real problems, because anyone who looks at the photographs of the tent when it was discovered will see that at least one of the standing poles to keep the tent standing up was still standing. Now, if it had been hit by an avalanche, surely that would have been knocked over and flattened. Indeed, the tent itself is only partially covered in some snow, not a great amount at all. Also, there have been reports there were footprints that were clearly with the Dyatlov group breaking away from the tent. Now, had there been an avalanche that had covered the tent or covered the area, those footprints would surely have disappeared. If perhaps they broke out of the tent because they heard the rumblings that sounded it was going to be perhaps an avalanche, then surely they'd be able to judge whether or not it sounded sufficiently dangerous that it would present a threat. Indeed, to the point they'd have to cut their way out of the tent. So, I don't know. To me, the avalanche theory, whilst perhaps on first examination seems plausible, and when you really look at it, it doesn't make an awful lot of sense. I mean, there is the other sort of earth-ground-based possibility of an earthquake being the cause of their panic, the sudden low trembling, the shaking of the earth that may have then caused them to panic and try to leave the tent. But as far as I'm aware, there's no sign or evidence of an earthquake anywhere having occurred or been recorded. So it kind of rules that idea out as well. Theory in itself is interesting, both as a natural phenomenon and as an artificial one. Talking about artificial at first, there was some research into the use of infrasound as an experimental weapon, but Weapon technology as it was, if it existed at all, would have been the size of a large lorry. In order for that to be sighted high in the mountains, it would have been noticed, I'm sure, and how you got it up there in the first place. Equally, if it was an infrasound weapon, then what happened to it? Was it never used again? Was it ever used? Is there any other instances where we can recall the use of a Soviet-made infrasound weapon? If it was a natural phenomenon, has it ever been experienced again before or since this particular occasion? Are there other occasions where people are aware of strange, low, heavy frequency booming sounds, or even so low frequency that you don't hear them, you only feel them? Is that sufficient to cause panic in the group? I don't know, but it seems, I think, unlikely. So we come on to the other theories. Now, store behind this idea of the strange lights anomalies that were being seen, both by another tour group further down the Ural Mountains, and have been seen before and since in the immediate area of the mountains, so that there could be something there. Difficult to determine the exact cause of the lights that were seen. I personally find it as an explanation, at least, of some of the events, i.e. the leaving of the tent and the fear of going back. I find it quite a plausible argument that these strange light anomalies were occurring in the sky. The obvious question, as I just said, would be, was it man-made or was it otherworldly? Well, thinking about the idea of being man-made first of all, I actually spoke to Svetlana Oss, who is an author who's written about the case. I mentioned her at the beginning, just to get an idea of what she thought. And she actually took me in the direction of a radio interview she gave herself, which she discussed this as a possibility, where she herself looked into whether or not the Russian military were actually carrying any operations at the time. And I just wanted to play this little clip to you. This is from Svetlana talking about this particular area.
Of course, official management of Cosmodrome, for instance, was asked many times whether it had fired or tested any rockets at the time of the incident. All the answers were negative, and they said that they can say for sure that the fall or crash of any rocket in the area is impossible. But also what I think is, if we go to... Okay, let me put it this way. We have some film of the students, and there are like 30 shots or frames of night sky. And for a very long time, these shots were considered like no one gave any attention to it. But finally, when zoomed up to many times, we saw these small flying objects in the sky. And the number of shots taken suggests that the whole event lasted at least 2 minutes. And because they were capable of taking these pictures, it implies that the objects were very far from them, like 180 miles, and thus they couldn't then be danger.
So, as Svetlana points out, there appears to be objects captured in the photographs that the group took of the night sky. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is, are these the orange lights that were seen by other mountaineers further down the Urals around the same date as the events were occurring? Are these UFOs? Are they missiles? Well, from what Svetlana's saying there, they're not going to be missiles, because she actually checked to ensure that there was nothing being launched that day. Indeed, I know from other researchers that the nearest base was a considerable distance away, and the missiles will never be fired in that direction. They'd be fired even further east, obviously, to then over areas where there's no population. So there's clearly something being captured in those photographs. It's difficult to see very clearly yourself, because many of the photographs that exist aren't quite damaged. Obviously, they're pretty old now. But she's made that study of the photographs, and indeed, as she says, her book talks about those photographs, which are very interesting indeed. The other credible writer, I think, that's talked about this incident, whose book I have, entitled Mountain of the Dead, which, as we said at the beginning, is a bit of a anomaly, because it's not really called that at all. He's Dead Mountain. In fact, the author himself admits, yeah, he's called Dead Mountain, but it makes a nice title. Was Keith McCloskey. Now, Keith's book goes into a lot of detail about all the theories we've just spoken about, but also into quite a bit of detail regarding these strange light anomalies. Indeed, he uncovered a case in 2002 where strange light anomalies were seen quite close by to a bauxite mine that was not a million miles away from where the Dyatlov Pass is located. And I think easiest if I allow Keith himself to explain the details of this particular sighting in 2002. And I think if you listen to what Keith has to say, you can see how it does relate to the events at Dyatlov Pass in 59, that there may well be some connection there. But this is Keith in an interview he gave to Coast American show a couple of years back.
All right, let's get strange here. Let's get funky. Yuri Yakimov comes forward. I don't think anybody but you has this part of the story. Tell me what his tale is and how it relates.
Yeah, well, Yuri Yakimov was working as a shift foreman in a city just over 100 miles away from the Dyatlov Pass. It was a bauxite mine. He was working there one night in 2002, and it was getting dark. He worked 12-hour shifts, and he just started his shift at 9 o'clock. It was dark, and he was just going to one of the pits where, the bauxite was dug out. And he said everything was dark and totally silent. And he said when a light suddenly switched on, it was surrounded by forest, this pit. And he said a beam was directed at him from the forest. And he said it was an intensely powerful beam that lit up the whole area. When he looked at it, several other lights started breaking away from the main beam and coming towards him. So he looked away and ran into the pit, because at first he thought maybe they had a lot of theft, burglars looking for metal and stuff like that. So he switched on the lights in the pit and then looked up again, but the beam was still there. The lights had disappeared, the other lights had broken away, but again, the lights started appearing, spreading out from the main light and coming towards him. And he said it was like several people were running towards him holding halogen flashlights, because they were jumping up and down and coming towards him. But the overriding emotion he felt was fear. He said it wasn't inquisitiveness. He shouted to say who's there, and he said the lights just kept coming. So he hid and looked away and stayed there for a while and then looked out again. And he said the light was still there. And every time he looked at it, the light started coming towards him. So eventually he just ran away up to the main road and got in a lorry and got away from it. He said he felt really terrible for a few days afterwards. But the overriding emotion, as I say, was fear. He was afraid of what he was seeing. And he told quite a few people about this particular incident, and he went back the following day during daylight and walked around to see if he could find any evidence of what had been there, and he couldn't find anything. So nobody would believe him. They just thought he'd been working too hard and it was all nonsense and what have you. And a couple of months later, he was reading a newspaper and he saw an article written about a forest ranger in the same area who had had an experience with lights that disturbed him. So he set out to track this forest ranger down, and eventually he did. A guy called Rudkovsky. He had worked in the forests for most of his life, and he basically lived in the forest, so he was used to spending nights alone and dealing with bears and wolves and what have you. So he wasn't a guy who was easily afraid of anything, and he had exactly the same experience. He said one night he'd set a campfire up, and a beam turned on him from some distance away. Again, he mentioned a very, very powerful beam, which didn't cast any shadows. He said it was almost like daylight. And the same thing happened to him. He looked at the light, and then other lights started spreading out from it and coming towards him. And he had a rifle with him, but again, his overriding reaction to the lights coming towards him was to get away from them. So he hid behind a log and stayed there. And then he heard a snapping sound after a while, as if like a giant electrical discharge, followed by winds, quite strong winds. And then when he looked up, the light had gone. So we waited till the morning, and then he went over to the area where the lights had been, and he looked around. And this guy Rudkovsky knew what to look for with tracks. You know, he could tell what birds had been around, or what bears, wolves, any type of animal. He couldn't find anything. He said it was just as if nothing had been there. But again, his overriding emotion was one of fear. He was afraid of what he was seeing and what it might do to him. So following on from that, Yakimov had got him to sign a sworn statement as proof of it.
Well, they certainly don't sound like the kind of thing that will be used by Russian military equipment. They do sound, for want of a better word, paranormal or supernatural, certainly. How and why is a mystery. Again, exactly what they are and what causes them, I really wouldn't like to say with any certainty. However, Keith's interview goes on to explain that Yakimov himself, the guy who experienced these strange lights in 2002, he actually developed his own theory about what may have happened to the Dyatlov Pass group. And I'll let Keith continue with the interview and for him to explain to you what he thought, as Yakimov thought, was actually happening.
But Yuri Yakimov developed this theory that this is possibly what happened to the Dyatlov group, and he thinks that these lights may have had some kind of directed energy weapon, and that is what caused the worst of the injuries to the Dyatlov group, that the tent was possibly flooded with light. They didn't know what the hell it was, maybe thought there was some kind of military vehicle about to run them down, slash their way out, and were hit. The worst of the injuries were caused by these directed energy beams at the people who were injured. The rest of them just ran away and died of the cold.
So there you have it. Whether or not we can say definitely that the lights existed and were the cause of the entire incident, I don't know. But there seems to be a fair degree of evidence to suggest that some kind of light anomaly has played a part in the events. With Svetlana talking previously about lights, images being caught in some of the photographs of the night sky. The fact that she checked that there was no launches that were actually occurred around that time. There was nothing on those lines happening, yet there was another tour group, as I said earlier, further down the Ural Mountains, who reported seeing yellow lights in the sky in the direction of where the Dyatlov Pass is. And we have Yakimov's experiences, which were also echoed by another person who was a sort of wildman, shall we say, living out in the woods or working in the woods, that there are strange light anomalies that do seem to be intelligently operating, being that they can actually follow and chase people and have a detrimental effect. And one of the things that Keith also talks about is the fact that these guys are experienced mountaineers and they're mountain men. They're used to working out in the cold and the dark. Yet they were both frightened by the lights, terrified by them. So almost suggesting that maybe there was a psychological effect of the lights, more than just being blinding. They actually made you think or feel something that was out of the ordinary. This is all very intriguing. Of course, this brings us on to the question of the mysterious photograph in frame 33, which has led to a lot of speculation that may well have links to these lights. So I think we should look at this particular photograph in a bit more detail. Frame number 33 of the film, taken by Krovina Shenko, is a picture that has invited a lot of speculation. It's the viral shot on the reel and has been described as looking variously like a very out-of-focus light object in the sky falling to the ground. Some have actually said they can see the face or features of a person in it. Others suggest it's simply light refraction in the camera. It is really quite hard to identify exactly what is in frame number 33. It does look, to me, I would have said that it is light caught in the camera lens, as if the lens cap has been left off and the shot has been taken completely out of focus. But there are those who have suggested that it is actually a photograph of the night sky, again out of focus, and that one of the strange orangey yellow lights that had been seen in the area around the 1st and 2nd of February, that this is actually one of those lights captured on the camera. I know that a Dyatlov Pass enthusiast, Chris Torrens, has actually done some analysis work using the same kind of camera to create the same kind of effect, and that has been quite successful in that it has created the internal light refraction effect with the camera. Now, of course, it could be that you are still talking about an external light source some distance away that is then caught in the prism of the internal camera mechanism to create this effect. Either way, it is the final shot on the reel, number 33, and it is quite a strange photograph. This is another explanation given for the strange light. Now, reading here directly from a technical report into the image, and it says the following. The technician in the crime lab was given a camera with a film inside, which he has to develop and give back to the investigators. This, of course, is the film we're talking about. Old cameras have film in a cartridge. The camera makes a photo by pressing the shutter, then using the film advanced lever to draw the next blank frame into the cartridge. Some people did right after, and some did right up before the previous shot. The technician has no way of knowing if the camera is in position 1 or position 2, i.e. is there a frame in position when he opens the camera, or has the film moved on? Rewinding the film is only possible in position 1. The technician can either use the frame advance lever, which will not work if the camera is in position 2, or press the shutter, which will not work if the camera is in position 1. Pushing the lever too hard can damage the film. Usually lab technicians pressed the shutter. If it didn't go off, then the film was rewound. If it does go off, then the film can be rewound, and the last one can be discarded as a technical photo, which essentially what this is supposed to be, which captures whatever is in front of that particular moment. A wall, ashtray, table, papers, lots of unidentifiable objects nearby, and always out of focus. The shutter on Krasnovashenko's camera was cocked, i.e. ready to take a photograph, so the notorious photograph number 33 came to life. Initially this frame was not presented in the investigation as part of the film, and it should have remained that way, because introducing that at a later time inflated even further the monotonous or monstrous significance the photo was gaining. So essentially what he's saying here is that it is dependent on how the camera is loaded, but if the film was set up to take one more shot, the camera has to be used, the shot has to be taken for the film to then be extractable. And this is what I understand is what this technical report is saying, that essentially the film had to be completed in order to be rewound and removed from the camera. Now, of course, it's entirely possible that that's a load of bunkum. In actual fact, this is a photograph of something that was witnessed that night, be it a fireball, be it an engine or a missile or an alien spacecraft. But it's interesting to note that there is quite a good, reasonable explanation as to the cause of this strange photograph. But as with so many things in this investigation, so much can be down to interpretation, what you wanted to see in these things. But of course this is by no means the only theory that has emerged to what happened to the group, and we'll look at another one in a second. I came across this theory on a website on the Dyatlov Pass Incident that was actually published only a few days ago. I think it's worth reading this in its entirety. I think it's certainly got some merit to it. It starts at the beginning. Has it ever been theorized that the group were attempting to make a retreat from the tent following the incident back towards the food cache or storage area near the Aspia River, where they had stored supplies and food on January the 31st, but instead became totally disorientated and went down the wrong side of the slope instead. Lots of the use of the word instead there, but I think we get the point. So essentially they were couldn't get to the tent because of whatever had occurred, but were trying to get to the food cache or storage area that was nearby. That's an interesting idea. The writer, Thomas Whiteside, goes on to say, looking at the maps, it doesn't seem to be dissimilar distance from the tent to the cedar tree. So in other words, he's saying that the distance between the cedar tree where two the group definitely died, and probably the others were also located for a while, is not a great deal of difference within the distance between the tent and the actual food cache that was elsewhere. Just reading on for a moment. This could explain the following decisions: to leave food, supplies and some clothing in the tent as they could be replaced once they'd reached the cache. To walk rather than run down the slope. If they had a plan to access food, shelter and clothing, they were perhaps calm and rational, not frantic and panicked. That's an interesting point. Why Zolotova, Kolotova, Dobinina and Thorio Brignoyers, this is the names I have trouble with, I have to be honest, decided to keep heading down the slope. Maybe they thought the cache was a bit further downhill. Now, these are the four, of course, that were found in the small ravine a little bit further on, who weren't actually recovered until May, when the snow thawed. It could even explain the possible fist fight between Dyatlov and Slobodin. Perhaps they'd argued about whether they were going in the right direction. Admittedly, this point is rather weak in support of the theory. I don't know if it's that weak, actually. I think they probably had some kind of fight to do with direction of what they were doing, where they were going. I think that was probably the cause, if there was a fight at all. And judging by the injuries of the two of them, which we talked about earlier on, I think that's quite possible there was some kind of fight or dispute or squabble between them. And he goes on to say this is all total conjecture, but the idea of an orderly retreat seems to fit with Dyatlov's reputation for ingenuity and level-headedness. Obviously, this theory hinges on what exactly was they had at the cache, how much shelter the cache provided, and how far away the cache was from the site of the tent. I think he's got some interesting points there. I mean, I'm going to go back in a moment. We'll have another look at the map area and get an idea of the possible distance, if there is any kind of weight to the idea that it could have been that's where they were heading for, but went in the wrong direction. I mean, is it a feasible distance away to be found in the middle of the night in the dark? But certainly the idea that they were retreating to another place of safety that they knew existed, i.e. the cache, rather than running rampantly down the hill away from whatever's going on at the tent, I think makes some sense. Of course, there's no way of explaining in this particular theory as to what on earth had led them to leave the tent in the first place, because that, of course, is probably the biggest mystery of the whole lot. But I think it's worth considering that this gentleman, Thomas Whiteside, may have a point. Just looking now actually at the map, showing the location of the cache, the storage house, in relation to where the hikers ended up, there is certainly some possible weight to the argument that he makes that what they basically did was exit the tent in the wrong direction. That the orderly path that they took, which took them down the side of the mountain, effectively, if they'd gone the other side of the ridge on which they were on, they would have headed back down towards the storage house. Indeed, the ravine where four of the group were found in May, once the thaw had completed, is almost the same distance to the storage house, but on the other side of the ridge. So the idea that they actually exited the right side but went directly in the wrong direction, but were heading, they thought, towards the storage house, is not impossible. I think there's must be some validity to this whole idea, because as I said, distances. Clearly, if they reached the cedar trees, they were obviously getting into a more wooded area and realised that they were at the edge of the wood, but didn't realise they were on the edge of the wrong side of the wood, wrong side of the pass, effectively the pass itself. So the idea that the others may have continued in the belief that they were heading towards the storage house, because the small ravine they were found in is not that much further on, although as I say, in the wrong direction, to where the storage house is. whereas perhaps the of himself, Sobodin and Kolomangarskova, where they decided perhaps they were going to head back to the original tent, in the hopes that perhaps they could find supplies and survive the cold there. So the idea, just to recap there, that perhaps they did exit the tent with the intention of heading for the storage house, but going in the wrong direction, I can see as being a real possibility. Nikolai's photographs and the infamous Frame 17. Frame 17 has become the source of much speculation regarding the idea of them, the group, encountering the Yeti, or abominable snowman, or Menk, as the Mansi people called them. The photograph itself shows an image of something in the middle distance in the picture, perfectly framed, so clearly this was what was being photographed. It wasn't just caught by accident. Unfortunately, the way the camera has worked has meant that the tree that is slightly to the right and quite close in the foreground is the centre of focus, so everything else behind is out of focus. Now, it does, for all the world, look like a tall, dark, hairy creature in the background, having a very long face with no obvious sign of a neck, apparently being covered in dark, mid to dark, what looks like grey hair, but I would imagine would have been brown probably, or black in colour, and a fair amount of snow in the surrounding area around him. It is interesting that it is the only photograph that shows any kind of out of focus problem. All the other shots from 1 to 17 from Nikolai's camera are at least in focus. Even objects in the distance are in focus. So the fact that this is so out of focus suggests possibly it was taken fairly quickly. It's worth also noting that frame 16, the one immediately before this supposed Yeti photograph, again shows one of the group partially in the snow, bent over and looking back at the camera. And it is entirely possible that it could well be the same person, because they are wearing the hood of the coat that they're wearing, and it's quite long, quite elongated, suggesting an overly large head, which would be the same kind of shape and proportions as the figure that appears in photograph 17. So it's quite possible that we are actually looking at one of the group in the distance, in the middle distance, possibly pretending to be the Yeti, or just being captured in a photograph. There is clearly a footprint trail leading from where the cameraman is standing to the figure in the distance. So either the figure has walked back along that path, or has walked to the point of the distance in order to either deliberately or otherwise create the impression of being a Yeti or Menk or abominable snowman in the middle distance. Indeed, this was the main focus of attention of a Discovery Channel program made a couple of years ago, looking into the mystery of what had occurred, and rather squarely pointing the blame at the idea of it being a Yeti. Personal view, I think it's more likely to be one of the group that's dressed down, either deliberately or otherwise pretending to be a Yeti, but not, I don't think it is an actual abominable snowman. Indeed, it's something that I've spoken to with a colleague and fellow sort of interested in the paranormal, a chap called Richard Freeman, who's very much focused on cryptozoology, and his opinion is that whilst the Menk may well exist, this probably is not an example of a Menk at all. In fact, he's probably quite likely one of the tour group.
So, even if the photograph itself isn't genuine, what about the possibility that they were actually attacked by the Yeti, a Menk? That is exactly what attacked the tent?
Well, there were no footprints other than those that were clearly identifiable as belonging to the participants in the hiking holiday were visible. Footprints that would be made by such a creature would be very obvious, being physically much larger than a human being, and very clearly barefooted entirely. So, despite the existence of that particular photograph, which, again, we've talked about earlier, which I think is more likely to be that of one of the group, although others have speculated it is an image of the Yeti, the cryptozoological creature, which, of course, was the focus of the Discovery Channel program a few years ago. But, nevertheless, it can't be completely ruled out, of course, but I think it's probably on the unlikelier side of the scale of causes for the events and the reason why the guys abandoned their tent.
So, what else do we have? Well, getting into the more sinister realms, sinister in terms of real-world sinister realms, we are looking at possible KGB involvement, Russian military involvement for some reason or other, that the guys either witnessed something they shouldn't have seen or stumbled into something that they shouldn't have stumbled into, that they were then decided to be removed or eliminated in such a way as to scare other people away from investigating the area. That's a possibility. You know, why would they leave the bodies? They could easily have disappeared them off into another part of Russia and never to be seen again. Left behind in order to be act as effectively as a warning to anybody else who went nosy around this particular region. We certainly know that there were experimental sites not too far away where things were being tested, but there's certainly no major missile launches or missile sites even particularly close to this area. So it's unlikely that they would have witnessed some kind of military testing of things like missile launches. That seems very unlikely. But it doesn't discount the possibility that there are elements of the discovery of the bodies that do raise questions. There was, of course, the report by a helicopter pilot who claimed to have flown over the site just days before it was discovered and saw bodies very close to an abandoned tent. And he assumed from what he was seeing that the site had already been found and was being investigated, when in actual fact it wasn't found for a couple of more days, and that the bodies were significantly, obviously, further away from the tent than what the pilot believed he witnessed. Now, I've not been able to trace too much myself online about that pilot's statement. It is something that I've heard in other interviews and discussions regarding the incident, but I've not been able to find any definitive evidence or reports regarding these helicopter sightings of the bodies being close to the tent. So I can't say much more on that about them myself, but again, I'm not going to rule it out that the whole thing was actually a staged incident to create an impression of an accident occurring when in actual fact they were deliberately murdered. We'd have to get into the question of how they were murdered. Were they simply made to stay in the snow until they froze to death? Did they make no attempt to escape? If they had attempted to escape, then surely if it was military involvement, they would have been shot, and we'd be looking at bodies with bullet holes in them, which of course we're not. So could they be made to simply sit still and freeze to death at gunpoint, or would you have made some kind of attempt to escape rather than slowly freezing to death? Would take the chance of being shot and dying at least quickly by tackling those that were holding guns to your head. I mean, I think if I were in that kind of situation, I wonder how the hell I got there, but if I were in that kind of situation, that would be my choice, to at least tackle my oppressors in an attempt to escape. No matter how hopeless it might be, I'd rather that than slowly freeze to death in the snow. So, I don't know. Were the others trying to escape? They were beaten up and then thrown into a ravine? Well, from what we've read and heard, the injuries they suffered were too substantial to have been caused by fellow human beings, and look more like, as I said earlier on, like car crash victims. That they've been physically hit at great force or great strength and actually caused these injuries. Excuse me, suggesting more than simply being bashed about, that they were actually very severely physically assaulted in order to cause death. Also, we have the question again of Luda's tongue and oral cavity being emptied out and removed. This still defies explanation. If it were military investigation or military action, why on earth would they go to that kind of extremes for one person? Of course, none of this explains why one person was wearing highly irradiated clothing. Perhaps if it was that they'd stumbled into something to do with the military, that's exactly how it became irradiated. Again, purely speculation. Can't be sure, of course, of any of this. But there we have it. That's, to me, the theories that stand out as having some reality to them, as being possible explanations. The other one, of course, that is worth mentioning is again those lights that perhaps they were UFOs, that they were abducted by a UFO and then subsequently dumped down, particularly the four found in the ravine, that perhaps they had experienced medical examinations by UFO occupants and then were literally dumped down in a nearby ravine. Again, I'm not sure about that. I don't think there's good evidence, unless it was all staged, of course, as we just said. But other than that, I don't think there's good evidence that they died anywhere other than where they were found, which would mean it's unlikely that they were abducted, taken away, and then brought back and placed back where they were. Again, speculating, I don't know. This is only my theorising. As I said at the beginning of the show, I'm not here to give my definitive explanation of what I think absolutely happened. I'm just putting forward possible theories and just trying to evaluate whether they can be regarded as being realistic or otherwise Fruit Loopy. So that's the best I can really do with it. The only thing at the end of the day we can say for absolute certainty is 9 hikers went into the mountains of northern the Urals for a skiing trip, skiing holiday, ski tourism as it was known, and none of them came back alive. They unfortunately met some kind of violent, unexpected end in the early hours, perhaps, or late evening of February the 1st, February the 2nd, 1959. Sorry, I'm taking it back in time here. 1959. Exactly how or why they died remains speculation. Certainly, 5 died of hypothermia, 4 died of injuries, and 1 died of hypothermia and injuries. How the injuries occurred is unknown. The same 4 people were together who suffered the more severe injuries. Others, all the others, had some kind of physical injury besides dying of the hypothermia itself. So they all experienced some kind of trauma or violence of some form or another, whether it was between each other, fighting each other, or fighting off external forces. Again, we could only speculate. But it remains, to this day, a mystery. There are other theories out there, a little bit more wilder. The idea that perhaps they were attacked by a group of the Mansi, which makes no sense because they aren't particularly violent people. And if it were the Mansi, why did they leave them to suffocate or freeze to death? Wouldn't it have been easier just to have shot them? The Mansi are armed. Quite naturally, they're reindeer herders that live out in the wilderness. Also, if it were the Mansi, why didn't they take stuff from the tent? There was all sorts of things that were useful in that tent. Food, supplies, torches, knives. None of it was touched. None of it was removed. It was all left there. Indeed, the Mansi themselves had warned the group that to stay away from the area because it's very inhospitable. Not because it's particularly scary or there's monsters out there, but it's just not very nice. It's very open, very barren place to go. So there are other theories include the idea that they were actually attacked by a group of escaped prisoners from one of the nearby gulags, except there wasn't any nearby gulags. I think the closest was about 60 miles, and these were from a throwback from the old Stalin days of oppression, and that they were gradually being closed down. So the chances are that if they were escaped prisoners, they would have headed either towards the nearest large town to mingle or disappear, or certainly headed further south into much more comfortable climes. It would hardly have headed further north into the mountains, where obviously poorly equipped and poorly dressed escapees from prison wouldn't last any longer than the Dyatlov group themselves lasted. So those two theories seem a little bit extreme, a bit absurd. In fact, one individual came forward later years to have actually claimed to have been the sole survivor of the incident, that he actually claimed that there were escaped prisoners in the mountains, that the escapees in the mountains were actually responsible for the death of the group. The problem is, no one ever heard of this guy before. He even mispronounces, like me, mispronounces many of the group's names, and you did the sole survivor, had never heard of him. So it sounds more like somebody coming forward simply looking for publicity. So there we have it. That is, as far as I've been able to determine, the nature of the events of the Dyatlov Pass Incident. Remains to this day a mystery, and I suspect, like other mysteries of its kind, probably will always remain a mystery. There are reports and ideas that perhaps there are other secret records being held by the Russian military services into their investigation into the events. There are certainly questions that can be raised around the investigation itself, the way it was carried out, who was involved in it, the fact that there are very few records of people being interviewed and talked to about the tourists and their experiences prior to what had happened here. So there is a suspicion that perhaps the investigation itself may have begun as early as the 6th of February, long before the group were even reported missing, where the official report date was the 26th of February. Is there a secret file? Did the government or military know more than they've let on from the early days of the incident, as early as the 6th of February, knowing that something had happened to the guys only 5 days previously? Or is it a mistake on the cover of the file? Perhaps the date should be the 26th of February, that the 2 has been erased or rubbed off or not written down clear enough, or maybe the pen ran out of ink, I don't know. I mean, I've never seen the document myself, but this speculative theory that somehow the investigation began on the 6th is not to be completely ignored, but again, could be explained by something as simple as a missing number being written down. We are, of course, talking about the height of the Cold War. If it wasn't already at boiling point, it was pretty close to it, with the missile crisis only a year or so in the future. So Russian secretive record keeping wasn't unusual, of course. It was quite common that they were very secretive about what was going on behind the Iron Curtain, and the idea of 9 tourists suddenly dying for no obvious reason that could be explained would be something that would be embarrassing, probably, to the Soviet authorities, who believe they were in absolute control of everything. So people to suddenly pop off and die in mysterious circumstances is not something they would necessarily want reported to anybody. So there we have it. I don't know if there's much more I can say at this particular juncture about this incident. It's certainly a topic I want to return to in the future, and in fact I'm already considering possibly a show in February next year, which will be an anniversary date, of course, of the incident itself, and perhaps get someone on to talk about it, perhaps on Skype, a recorded interview with somebody about it. There's a couple of people who pop into mind. Svetlana also, I mentioned earlier on, we had a brief clip from her investigation, her writing, of course, on the experience, or my friend Chris Torrens, who has not written anything publicly, but has put a lot of information on Facebook, on his Dyatlov Pass group. I think either one of these two guys would be very interesting to talk to properly about the incident and get their views and opinions. So I can see this being a topic that I'm going to definitely return to at some point in the future. I'll say probably next February, on an anniversary date of the event itself. If you want some more information about the Dyatlov Pass incident and would like perhaps read some of the books that are available, I should mention 2 in particular, of course, as they both feature on the programme, although only one of them knows they're on my programme, but anyway. The first one, what I should really mention, is Svetlana Oss's book, Don't Go There, The Mystery of the Dyatlov Pass, which is available through Amazon. If you check it out on Amazon, you'll find it under Don't Go There, The Mystery of the Dyatlov Pass. ISBN number, if you like, you can look that up that way, which is 978 151 7755591. Always the easiest way to find one. Obviously, if you listen to the podcast version of this, you can just rewind it and listen to those numbers again. But otherwise, you can find it quite easily via Amazon. It's an Amazon Create Space independent publishing book. The other title I mentioned, which is English writer by the name of Keith McCloskey. His book, Mountain of the Dead, The Dyatlov Pass Incident, is out from History Press. And again, as I was saying in the programme, it goes into a lot of detail, including a theory about the strange effect of the light anomalies that have been seen in the area, both at the time and afterwards. Again, ISBN number, often easiest way to find these things, is 978 07524914886. Both books well worth reading. I've had both of them myself and quite enjoyed reading them. As I say, Keith goes into a lot of detail about the different theories behind it. Svetlana has the advantage of being, of course, that she is actually Russian herself, so she's read the documents in the original Russian, and inevitably, as with most things, there probably are slight changes in meaning in the translation, where the words aren't exactly the same as we might know them. So I think it's worth definitely reading hers from the perspective of her being a Russian native. So those are the 2 books I would recommend. There are others out there that I consulted while I was working on this, but I found those 2 to be probably the best.
And there you have it, my original show on the Dyatlov Pass Incident that I recorded just over 3 years ago now. Sorry if I rambled a little bit or got a bit off track. It was quite an interesting experience recording an entire show on my own, reading mainly obviously from my own notes. Hopefully my radio style has improved a little since then, but I hope you enjoyed that as a little extra. Steve's usual show will return again very soon, of course. It's just a little extra dip in, a little extra thing for you to listen to. And I hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye for now.